Hello and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today I am excited to talk to the artist behind this stunning new picture book, Coming Home, a Hopi Resistance Story. That's from Mavasta Honyouti, and we are going to be talking to him today. If you haven't entered this week's giveaway, be sure to do that. It ends tonight at midnight and you don't want to miss out. It's a really great book. And thank you all for your support that allows us to do. You all for joining us. And we'll have this week's author on soon. If you haven't gotten your copy, you should all go out and get one. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good. Thank you for joining us and for accommodating. For those that don't know, you're also a teacher, and we appreciate our teachers and for you taking time out of your day to talk with us. So thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
For those that don't know you, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us your journey to becoming an author, but maybe before that, how you became an artist.
Sure. I'll start with introducing myself. The Yoi Aoya Yan Matio Gyang, the by name Mavasta Yan Tui the Iswong Wana Hodangak. My name is Yoi Aoya. My people know me by Mavasta. I'm from Hotvalla, Arizona, and I'm Coyote Clan. And like you said, I'm a teacher. I teach right now. I'm teaching 6th through 8th grade math, and before that, I've been a social studies teacher. And I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in societies and cultures, and so sharing that with my students was always an important part of my job. And all during that time, I've been an artist. I've been a wood carver, and it's a craft that I've learned from my dad, and he learned from his dad, and that's who's also involved in the story. And I rarely share that part of me with my students. And when it comes, like when they find out, or if I go to a major art show or something, and I'll share with them the different experiences that I've had. Then it opens up a new, I guess, like world to them, a new way to connect to them as well, because I have a lot of creative students, and art is a big part of our culture. And so it's a good way to build those connections and build relationships, and then just sharing the experience and sharing the journey, and allowing them to follow their own creative paths, whatever they want to pursue. And it's really neat because when I was working on the artwork for this book, I took it to class, and I showed them the whole series. And there's it's a whole 16 panel layout. And I told them what it was for, and I told them this time next year, this time next year, this will be printed in a children's book. And that idea it didn't connect until I actually had the hard copy of the book, and I showed them on publishing day, which was last November. And I told them, and then it was actually on election day too. I said, I know election's happening, but there's something even bigger, something more important. I think I shared with them, and I showed them the book, and they were excited, and so they wanted me to read it to them right away. So just having that experience along with them was probably the best part of
Right.
this whole experience.
And we should mention, because what I think makes your book so unusual is, like you said, there was it 16 panels, that these are all carvings
Yes.
that you painted, and you actually had them as an exhibition of just the panels. I mean, and so I'm curious for you, you're so used to kind of being a storyteller through your art. What was that like to kind of translate that into a book, to write the text to go along with it? Was that hard, or did it just seem very natural?
It was hard at first. Um, I when I was approached by the editor from the publishing company, he sent me an email and told me that he had come across my artwork and was interested in asked if I'd ever consider writing a story, you know, for a book. And I'm like, no, I never, you know, thought of that. And he said, well, think about it. I like your work, and I know there's a lot behind, you know, what you create. And it's like, okay. I didn't really believe him. A month later, you know, he follows up and he's like, hey, are you still interested in this idea? And I'm like, oh, okay, I think he's serious. And so I thought about, you know, little stories that I would tell my kids, and during the pandemic, I would share little funny stories about our animals. We have 2 dogs, and I tell them little stories that what they would do when we go to bed, and how they would have their own little gatherings, and you know, have these little parties and stuff like that. And I thought maybe that would be something I could do, and I was like, no, I kind of, you know, want to maybe some other time. And then we returned after when we returned back to the school year. We were doing virtual learning for a while, and then finally it went into in-person instruction, and so we're, you know, back in the classrooms. And every year when I start a new school year, I introduce myself and I tell them who I am and where I'm from and my name, and then I talk about the history of my name. And I was like, okay, there's an idea. And so I shared that with the editor, and he was like, let's do it, let's go with that. And so we kind of built on that. And the story is, it starts out, you know, just from a childhood memory of mine, of me spending time with my grandfather in our cornfield. And I'm bored, and I'd rather be home and, you know, watching cartoons or riding my bike and, you know, doing things like that. But here I am with him in the summertime, and it's hot, and, you know, I'm sitting under the tailgate, you know, watching him while he's out there working on the crops. But I thought about what was he doing when he was my age? You know, like, we're completely different generations, but, you know, he was probably doing the same thing, you know, sitting out there at that same field with either his father or his grandfather. And it's kind of where that story begins. But it was actually my dad who told me about his story, my grandfather's story, and that's how it started. It came to be, and I wrote the outline, and I basically just did a speech to text feature on my iPad. You know, just started telling the story the way that I remember my dad telling me about it, and then from there, you know, went back and looked at the writing and edited, you know, what I needed to edit, and he went back and forth with all the technical parts of writing, and so this was my first experience with that, and I really got to learn a lot about how I guess the whole process of you know, publishing, from the planning to the publishing and everything in between. Yeah, so
I'm curious, when you shared this with your students, were they surprised at the story? Did they know that, like, similar stories in their own families, or were they not very familiar with it? What was their reaction?
I it was actually the older generations, my students' grandparents and parents, because when they started sharing the artwork, that was even before the book. Then they started sharing their family histories of their relatives who had gone to boarding schools and things like that. And so we we covered that in class, and we talked about the different experiences that people had, positive and negative, you know. But it definitely shaped our history, and shaped the educational system that we currently are in. And it's interesting that I'm a teacher within that system now, and I have the opportunity to tell us a side of history that isn't often shared, and I take advantage of that opportunity. You know, it's a very very powerful voice that is usually underrepresented. So I have the opportunity to share that with my students, and it builds a really strong connection with us again, and because we have shared experiences, through our relatives and our grandparents and the previous generations.
Yeah, and one of the things that I thought was so interesting in your grandfather's story that you tell is that he went to residential school, was basically kidnapped to be taken there, but
Mm.
he also, this is a story of resistance and ultimately of joy, that he still found joy and found a way to pass on these traditions. What kind of story do you hope, I mean, what kind of lesson do you hope readers take away from the book as far as kind of resistance when people are trying to go against your culture, going against who you are?
I think holding on to the identity, the history and the traditions that their families have held on to. We aren't just ourselves. We come from families. We come from our ancestors. We come from our grandparents, and they have their own unique experiences and journeys on how they came to be where they are, and we're here because of them. And I think that the idea of resilience is something that I push forward, especially with my students, on how throughout history we learn about these different things that occurred with our native population and native cultures and groups of people, and we're still here. We're still a living culture and thrive, and we have living languages, and we're speaking the language, and that's a big reason why we translated this in Hopi as well.
Yeah.
It's fully translated in Hopi, and my coworker here at the school that I work at, she translated the whole story in Hopi, and we wanted to emphasize that through this boarding school initiative, the policies that were placed on the people, one of the intentions was to eliminate the language. But now we have the opportunity to write our own stories, and in the perspective that we want to share it, and the fact that we get to write it in our own language as well is something that we wanted to make sure that we make that known. And so from the story, from the translation, and the background of the history of Native American boarding schools, it's all about resiliency and strength and endurance, and the idea of resisting, just to keep the identity and keep what's important, keep that in close to heart, and protecting it however you can. And as far as how I ended the story, it goes through his whole process and from school, and there's a quite a gap from when he left school to it jumps right into him being how I remember him, being in going to the field every day and spending his day there, and working, and yes, and that's how I wanted to portray my grandfather. It was his happy place, and he won, in the end, despite the challenges that he had faced when he was a young boy. He has children and grandchildren, and he shared with us the things that we now get to do, today in our lives, and it's it was a way for me to honor him, and I thanked him for his for the story, and I had a good cry, and I had a good smile, and thanked him again, and that's how I wanted to end the story.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because you could have just written a story about him in residential school and ended it when he came home. But I love that you showed him as an adult and what he went on to do. Why did you choose to end it there, as you just said, when kind of at the end of his life?
Yeah, and it showed that resiliency and survival, and staying true to who he was, and it's actually a story of victory in the end, and that's how I wanted to what I wanted to portray. That's how I understood it. Becoming an adult later on. At the time, be sitting in the field when I was a kid, it wasn't fun. But now, coming back and looking back on those times, I cherish that, and I really appreciate that I got to have those experiences. And in a way, those are goals for myself. To be an old grandfather and being in that same place and having that type of happy feeling, in a place that has been within our family for generations. So that was the main reason why I went that route, because I wanted to end it with a good feeling, and then a good I guess movement forward. That it didn't end on something tragic, but he took that experience and turned it into a positive.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could talk more about the cornfield, because I was really intrigued by it, because you talk about how that was his happy place, and also you had, if anybody watching who hasn't gone to your Instagram, you should really go look at the Instagram, because you have a lot of your other artwork on and carvings and so on there, and you had one recently about a family in the cornfield in the evening, which I thought was so lovely. And you talk about how that's just, where people go traditionally, like every evening. Could you talk a little bit about the significance of spending time out in the field as a family and as a community?
Yeah, it's a big part of our culture, and families. That's the central, I guess, the central place of gatherings, aside from homes and villages in the village. But like for me, that was always my favorite memories were going to our field and seeing my cousins and seeing my uncles and seeing my grandfather, and we would have things, tasks to do when we were there, whether it was clearing weeds or um, you know um, scaring away the crows and the rabbits and things like that, doing our part. And or fighting, play fighting in between the stalks and chasing each other, and it was always a happy place. And the carving that you're referring to, it's an art piece that I have just recently installed here at home at our healthcare center. And it represents wellness and a family, and just sharing, and then with the nourishment of the crops that are grown in our fields and things like that. Just celebrating life, basically. And that was always one of my favorite memories growing up, because that's where we saw our family, and that's where we had gotten together, and that's where we did the work together, and we'd pick fresh the corn or melons, or whatever that was grown, beans, and we'd go home and we'd prepare it, and we'd all eat together and have these gatherings and things like that. So it's a huge part of my upbringing. And I know that for a lot of families, it's the same thing for them, because that's how what's essential part of our culture is the agriculture.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the actual process of creating the panels, because they're just so amazing. Maybe I'll show a few more of them in here. But and one of the things I loved about actually getting my hands on a copy of the book is that you share a lot of this at the back of the book, and I know you have on your Instagram as well. But could you kind of talk about the process of how you go about creating these amazing panels?
Sure. It's a craft that I've learned from my dad. I grew up. He's a artist. He's a wood carver as well. I took a different approach with the relief carving, and I've always liked the idea of sharing stories and sharing ideas and concepts of what the figures represent. And so I figured that I could display them differently, and so I went with the relief carving. And so it, the plaques, they're all carved out of the same material, which is a cottonwood root. It's a light wood. It's a driftwood, the root of a cottonwood tree. and it's a traditional material that we use as wood covers out here in Hopi. And I wanted to make sure that I stuck to the traditional material, and the panels are about around 8 to 10 inches in height and width. They're different sizes because the wood is. I don't have the materials and the tools to make them all perfectly cut, and everything's done by hand, and so they're different sizes. They're not all uniform, and they're maybe about a half inch thick, and so I would carve into the surface. Yeah, there you go. And some of the pieces are multiple pieces put together just to give me a bigger working surface. And I it's I try to create depth, so you might see that in there, spatial features um, and symbolism. The colors are important, and the symbolism is important, and so those are the essential theme of what was involved with the carvings. And when I shared the it was only half of the panels, because when we were coming up with the plan for the story, we needed the artwork, and it started out with 4 pictures, 4 images, and I was like, okay, yeah, I think I have enough material to do that. I think that's manageable. Sounds good. I can do that. And then it went up to 8 panels, and I was like, okay, a little bit more, but I think I can still do that. So I started getting my materials ready, and preparing the plaques and letting them set and everything like that. And then we were going back and forth with the draft, and it's like, well, I think we need something right here. And the editor was telling me, I think we need maybe one more right here, and I think we would close this out with this one. And I was like, okay, okay. And so it started out from 4, then it went to 8, then it went all the way to 16. And I was like, okay, that's I think that's a max. And then it came to the deadline, because they needed the images so they can start with the printing. And I had a deadline, and oh man, I was spending all my time trying to get all of them completed. And as soon as I was done, and we got them photographed, and they sent them off to the printer, and like, okay, everything's good, we're all set, good job. So what do you think about the next book? And I was like, what? I barely finished this one, you give me a break, like, let me catch my breath, that kind of feeling. But at the same time, he was telling me that this was the first of its kind, is talking about in this region in Hopi, the concept of the boarding school, sharing that story. And so he's like, give me more, like, I want something else. So maybe later on that'll be something that I can look into doing again. I actually wanted to share short stories, because I'm a teacher, and I come across different students and their experiences as well. And in their ways, they have victory stories as well, whether it's upbringing and challenges that they've had to face, and they've come out as winners in the end. Those are types of tales that I want to be able to share, because those are real experiences, and those are things that people can relate to and connect with.
And so do you think you'll do that as like a picture, like a similar format to what you've done in this book?
Well, this one's a children's book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking of doing, short stories, telling individual, little experiences.
Right.
So it might be a collection of short stories.
Nice. Oh, well, very, very cool. And I want to go back to the fact of being a middle school teacher, which I think is so awesome. And especially, as you said, like the fact that you're teaching now, after having your grandfather go through the residential school system, and now you're part of kind of an education system. And I read that you teach your kids to be intellectual warriors, arming them with knowledge of their traditions and customs to help them navigate the wider world. Why is that kind of education so important to kind of ground them in their traditions at the same time as they're navigating this wider world?
Our world is our world is constantly changing, and we have, there's often talk about Native people living in two worlds, and I understand that concept, but uh, my own personal thought is we're one. We have one world, and we go through this world um, evolving. Just like everything else, and we come from a place where, and we're fortunate to come from a place where the language is still strong, and the culture and the traditions are still, a lot of them are intact, and we follow a ceremonial cycle every year. And so there's very impactful knowledge that's being shared during those times, and it helps us realize our place, and it also shows us what types of capabilities we have, and of course, referring back to the history and stories of learning of where we came from and how things came to be, that gives us a foundation. And with Western education, we're learning about current events, we're learning about math, we're learning about science, and so all of these things that are outside of our, I guess, our center, um, are we're because of the world that's constantly moving and evolving and growing. Our students they come from a different place that I came from. The generation is there's a difference in how our upbringing is, and the things that we're exposed to and involved with. And so like for myself, I left home after high school and went to college and had a family when I was very young, and so I was exposed to different things outside of the village, and but I always needed to come home because I needed to be grounded. I needed to be, reminded of the things that gave me that foundation. And so eventually I returned home, and I knew this was the place to be because this is where I would be able to share that experience with my students, and allowing them to find their own path, and let them know that these things are available, these opportunities, these experiences, they're out there. But always hold on to those traditions and hold on to those teachings, because that will keep you grounded, and that will keep you to know who you come from, and what kind of strengths you're born with, and what you were brought up in. I guess your roots. And with the Western education, learning as much as you can, reading as much as you can, exposing your mind and thoughts to as much as you can, that it allows us to grow. And when it's their time to experience those things, they'll be able to navigate it a little bit easier, because they're prepared. And so, whatever path they choose as a career, if they go into college, if they go beyond that, they'll always have both sides, to equip them. And when it's time for them to return, if that's what they choose, then they'll have that experience to bring back to carry that on with the next group of young people. And so that idea of an intellectual warrior it just comes from the idea that we throughout history, our ancestors and people had always had to fight and defend the land and the resources and the people. And in the beginning times, it was on through combat, going face to face with defending the land and the resources and the people. And later on, those battles came through laws and policies. And so understanding that They don't have to, fight physically, but now that battle is, through intellect. And so that's the part where I talk about the intellectual warrior, using your mind to navigate and to learn those weapons, those secret tools and weapons on how to defend yourself when it comes to it.
Well, that is so powerful. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Again, I encourage everybody to get your own copies of Coming Home. And thank you for sharing your story with us. The book is so beautiful and powerful. And we appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and talk with us. And anybody, if you joined us late, this will be up in just a few minutes on Instagram. You can watch the whole thing, or if you prefer, it will be up later on YouTube, so you can watch it there as well. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the time and your invitation. Enjoy.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.